So today begins our series. We've started a series that we call our Connect series. So I think there are about 35 groups that have joined for the next 5 weeks to meet together, to experience the gift of small Christian community together as part of the parish. And what that involves is getting together, meeting together, spending some time together and reflecting upon the gospel for each Sunday and the homily. So the theme for this Connect series is From the Heart of the Tempest, Finding Faith in Life's Storms. And so yesterday's weather might have been a good introduction for the tempest as we experienced the deluge of rain. A tempest, of course, is a windstorm, usually with rain, so a wet time. And so we experienced the beginnings of that yesterday here in Sydney. But of course the idea is that this is actually a metaphor, that we all experience the storms of life in one way or another. That can look different for different people and at different times. The kind of storms of life that I'm thinking of are things like somebody losing a job or being anxious about what the future holds. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be a crisis of one sort or another. And the question that the series poses is, how do we find faith in the midst of those moments? The phrase "from the heart of the tempest" comes from the book of Job in the Bible. And in fact, it will be the first reading in a few weeks' time in our series. From the heart of the tempest. And I guess the idea here is that we all experience, in one way or another, the wrestle with the problem of evil. The question, of if I understand myself or somebody else to be a good person, how is it that bad things happen? Why is it that we experience trials and suffering in life, whatever shape or form that takes? That's actually the question of the book of Job. At the beginning of the book of Job, Satan goes before God and says to God, "Give me the man Job for a little while. I want to test him to see if he's really going to stay faithful to you if I strip him of everything." And that's exactly what happens. Job is stripped of all of the normal blessings of life. All of the good things that he enjoyed are taken away from him just to see if he will remain faithful to God. Job's friends gather around him and they give all sorts of explanations about why this has happened. They offer all sorts of reasons for why it is that Job is experiencing what he's experienced. Job doesn't find any of those answers satisfactory, but he gets to a point where he cries out and he says, "God, what on earth is going on for me?" And we're told at that moment that God speaks to him from the heart of the tempest. That in the midst of the storm, God speaks. And that's what I want to suggest to you as a theme for the next 5 weeks, is that when we come to the question of why is it that there's suffering in the world, why are there problems in life, what happens when I'm experiencing a trial of one sort or another, when I experience loss or suffering or difficulty, that the resolution to that, if you like, from God's point of view, is that he's not silent in those moments. It might seem like he is. The greatest example of this, I think, is actually when Jesus himself hangs upon the cross. And when he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" That's Jesus, the Son of God himself, in the midst of his suffering, saying, "Where are you, God, in this moment?" And it seems like God does not speak to him. There's no answer recorded there of what the Father says to Jesus at that moment. But the truth is that never was there a moment where God was not closer to his Son than that moment. And the word, if you like, that Jesus speaks at that moment, that the Father speaks to Jesus at that moment, is that he is there, that he's with him. The resolution Well, I say the resolution. There's no real resolution to the question of suffering. There's a mystery here that we can't get to the depths or the bottom of. But the promise of Christian faith is unlike any other answer, because it does say to us that God speaks in the midst of those questions, in the midst of the tempest, in the midst of the storm. And we see that in today's feast day, where we celebrate today in a particular way the gift of the Eucharist, the feast of the body and blood of Christ. I want you to think about the first Eucharist for a moment, the Last Supper. It's Thursday night, and it's absolutely a moment of tempest. There's a storm that's brewing all around Jesus and his disciples. His arrest is impending. His death is only some hours away. And Jesus chooses in that moment, as it were, the clouds thicken around him and his followers, to do something perhaps a little surprising in that situation. He has a meal with his friends. And it's at that meal that he says of the bread, "This is my body for you now." And he says of the wine, "This is my blood for you now." He speaks from the heart of the tempest. And the words that he says are not just words. The words that he says are to say, what looks like bread and wine will be me for you. Because he knew at that moment that what we needed was not just words, but presence. Just as those first disciples needed to know that he was with them, so do we in the midst of the trials and sufferings, in the midst of the tempest that life throws up against us from time to time. We need more than words, we need the presence of Jesus. And so he did not leave us just words, he left us himself. That every time we come to Mass, Jesus is present to us in a unique and powerful way, to know, so that we would know that just like in that first Eucharist, that he spoke, that he gave himself to his disciples in the midst of the storm, he gives himself to us in the midst of our storms too. That in the midst of the trials of life, in the midst of the difficulties we face, whatever that might look like, he comes to us, not with mere words, but with himself. And if you think about it for a moment, the bread broken, the wine poured out, that's Jesus' body broken upon the cross, his blood poured out for our sake. It's in the midst of his suffering that he meets us in our suffering. We do not have a God who is aloof from us. We don't have a God who is distant from us. We don't have a God who stands apart from us in the midst of our suffering. We have a God who is with us. A God who knows what suffering feels like from the inside because he is crucified, suffering the most terrible of deaths. He does not experience suffering vicariously. He doesn't experience suffering by watching us. In Jesus of Nazareth, God has suffered as we suffer. Every time we come to Mass, we meet Jesus in his broken body, in his blood poured out. This is not a God who is distant. This is a God who is deeply with us in the tempests of life. There's a strange mystery and paradox here. St Thomas Aquinas in a famous hymn will say, Godhead here in hiding. Godhead here in hiding, speaking of the Mass. Because it looks like bread and it looks like wine. Tastes like bread, it tastes like wine. The mystery is Jesus present under the form, under the species of bread and wine. That it's really him. That he is really present. Every Mass, Jesus is present to us, as it were, Godhead here in hiding. It takes faith to perceive and to understand that this is Jesus present to us. Why is that? Why couldn't he have just been a bit more obvious about it? Well, I'm not sure if we know exactly the answer to that question, but I do think this is true, that without faith, love is not possible. Because if it was just a matter of seeing Jesus present to us, and if that was obvious and apparent to us, then what that would mean is that there's no decision to freely love. Love has to be done in freedom, which means that when it comes to recognizing Jesus present amongst us, it requires faith. If Jesus had made himself obvious to us, if God had revealed himself to us without a shadow beyond doubt, if there was no veil, as it were, covering us and between us and God's presence, then we would have to believe, and that would mean that there would be no love involved, because love requires freedom. Love requires freedom. And so it takes faith to believe it. But when we do come with faith, what we find is Jesus present in the midst of our storms, in the midst of all the tempests of life. It does not change necessarily or take away the struggle or trial, but it provides the most sure presence, the greatest comfort and consolation to know that he is with us in the midst of our suffering, because he has suffered too, that he is for us and with us every time we receive him in Eucharist. And so as we come to the Mass together this morning, let's take a moment now just to pray that we might approach Jesus with the faith that's required, with the faith that's necessary. That it's not just bread that we're about to eat, but it's Jesus that we're about to enter into communion with, that we're to be one with him in this Mass.